There's something deeply unsettling to a manipulative or emotionally unstable person when the individual they used to control begins to heal. It's not just that you're getting stronger, it's that their grip on you is slipping and they can feel it. For a long time, they operated within a certain pattern, a predictable rhythm. You were reactive. You were emotionally invested in their every mood swing. You were caught in the loop of trying to fix things, trying to understand them, trying to hold together something that only you were fighting for. That dynamic gave them a sense of power, not in the noble or admirable sense, but in the subtle, often unconscious sense of emotional dominance. They knew how to push you, how to pull you back, how to provoke guilt, and how to weaponize affection. But healing ruins that script, because healing, real healing, doesn't announce itself. It starts silently, internally. It doesn't show up as a dramatic act of defiance. It begins as a shift in awareness. You begin noticing how often you were walking on eggshells, how much of your peace was sacrificed just to keep the relationship functioning. You start to recognize the patterns, not just in them, but in yourself. The moments you abandoned your own needs, the times you accepted behavior you never should have tolerated. That recognition is painful. It humbles you, but it also frees you. And once you begin to operate from that place of clarity, everything starts to change. You don't respond to the bait anymore. You stop over-explaining yourself. You begin holding boundaries, not out of anger, but out of self-respect. And that, to someone who relied on your emotional entanglement to maintain control, feels like abandonment. They don't understand the difference between distance and disrespect. They interpret your healing as a threat because for the first time, you're no longer giving them the emotional access they once had unrestricted access to. And this is where the panic begins. Not necessarily in loud outbursts, although that can happen too, but in the subtle shifts, the sudden niceness, the feigned vulnerability, the "I miss the old you" comments. What they're really saying is, I miss the version of you I could manipulate. Because healing makes you unpredictable to them, and that's terrifying. They don't know what version of you they're going to get anymore. The one that used to apologize just to keep the peace? Gone. The one who used to second guess himself because they couldn't handle being wrong? He's not there anymore. It becomes clear to them that your healing is dismantling the emotional scaffolding they relied on. The dynamic no longer works. The game doesn't go in circles anymore because you're not playing. And in a twisted way, that's the part they grieve. Not the relationship, not the connection, but the loss of control. The loss of emotional dominance. When someone benefits from your brokenness, your healing is their crisis. Now they have to face something they've avoided for a long time, themselves. Without your emotional reactions to distract from their own dysfunction, they're left sitting with it, and many of them can't handle that. So they reach, they test, they provoke, they try to draw you back in. Not because they've changed, but because your detachment has forced them out of the comfort zone they created at your expense. But you've changed now. You're no longer looking for validation where it was never truly offered. You're no longer confusing chaos with passion. You're no longer romanticizing pain. And here's the truth. That shift in you, that transformation, it doesn't just affect the dynamic, it redefines it. They can no longer identify you by your wounds because those wounds are closing. They can't manipulate you through fear because you're no longer afraid to walk away. And they certainly can't use your love against you because now you've learned to give love without losing yourself in the process. That's why healing makes them panic. It's not about you being better off, although that stings too. It's about you stepping into the version of yourself that no longer needs them, not because you stopped caring, but because you started caring in the right direction. Toward yourself, toward your peace, toward a future that isn't held hostage by the past. So yes, she'll panic when you start healing, because healing means freedom. And once you taste that freedom, you don't go back to being someone's emotional hostage. You don't shrink yourself to fit their comfort zone. You don't bleed just to prove your love. You move forward and you never look back. There's a quiet kind of power that comes when you no longer feel the need to engage in chaos. Not because you've lost interest, And not because you're indifferent, but because you've outgrown it. When you start to heal, you naturally begin to pull away from everything that kept you locked in cycles of emotional confusion. You stop reacting. You stop defending yourself. You stop participating in conversations that go nowhere and arguments that always seem to circle back to the same place. And that sudden silence, that stillness, that refusal to engage, it rattles her. Because for a long time, chaos was the glue that held the relationship together. Not harmony, not respect, chaos. The unpredictability, the tension, the highs and lows that created a false sense of intensity, that dynamic fed her. It gave her a sense of control. It gave her a reason to keep the focus on her emotions, her triggers, her insecurities. As long as you were reacting, she could justify her behavior. She could paint herself as the victim or the misunderstood one or the one who cared too much. But healing ruins that narrative. When you stop playing into the chaos, it exposes the truth that much of what felt like passion was actually emotional instability. And it becomes glaringly obvious who was creating the turbulence and who was simply trying to navigate through it. You start seeing that most of the conflict wasn't about resolution, it was about control. It was never about finding common ground, but about pulling you off balance just enough to keep you doubting yourself. And once you stop responding in the same way, once your nervous system is no longer hijacked by the emotional games, the panic sets in for her because she depended on your chaos, on your pain, on your confusion. It was all part of the unspoken agreement that kept the relationship alive. As long as you were tangled up emotionally, you couldn't see clearly, you couldn't leave, you couldn't focus on your own growth. She knew exactly which words to use, which moments to escalate, and when to offer just enough affection to reset the cycle. But the moment you started healing, the system stopped working. You stopped flinching at the bait. You stopped explaining yourself to someone who had no interest in understanding you. You stopped walking into traps disguised as conversations. And instead of being drawn into her storms, you started choosing peace, not because it was easy, but because you realized that no amount of arguing ever fixed anything. You realized that real love doesn't live in drama, that peace isn't boring, it's clarity. And once you got a taste of it, you weren't willing to trade it for the chaos anymore. And she feels that shift. She notices it. The lack of reaction, the calm responses, the emotional distance, it unnerves her because it disrupts the script she was used to. She starts asking questions, making accusations, testing your resolve. Not because she wants to grow or understand, but because she wants things to go back to the way they were, where she had control through emotional confusion. And here's the difficult truth. When someone thrives in dysfunction, your healing is a threat. Not because they don't want you to be well, but because your wellness takes away their ability to control the relationship. You see it clearly now. The chaos wasn't just an unfortunate byproduct of the relationship. It was a strategy to keep you emotionally dependent, exhausted, always trying, always apologizing, always adjusting. But healing gives you perspective, and perspective gives you power. You start seeing how often you were pulled into storms that had nothing to do with you, how many times you were blamed for things that were projections of her own pain. You see that the love you were giving wasn't being received, it was being used as leverage. And when that realization sinks in, you stop showing up in the same way. You stop overextending. You stop compromising your peace just to keep the connection alive. That's when she starts to panic, not because she misses you, but because she misses the emotional supply, the drama, the attention, the ability to pull you back in whenever it suited her. Your detachment forces her to sit with the void that used to be filled by your reactions. And that's uncomfortable, because now she has to confront herself, her actions, her role in the dysfunction. And most people who rely on chaos can't survive in silence. But you've chosen the silence. You've chosen clarity. You've chosen yourself, not in a selfish way, but in a deeply responsible way. You've stopped investing in what drains you. You've stopped prioritizing someone else's chaos over your own sanity. And in doing so, you've become free. That's why when you start healing, she starts panicking, because the emotional playground she once controlled is now empty. There's a moment often quiet and unspoken when your healing forces someone else to finally look inward. It doesn't come with a dramatic confrontation or a loud declaration. It comes with silence, with distance, with stillness. And for someone who has always relied on you to carry the emotional weight of the relationship, to absorb the blame, to take on the guilt, to be the one who's always fixing and apologizing and reaching out, your healing creates a void. That void becomes a mirror, and in that mirror, they start to see themselves clearly, maybe for the first time. You see, when you were caught in the chaos, when you were reacting, arguing, defending, chasing, there was always somewhere for her to redirect the blame. She didn't have to look at herself because your emotional responses gave her cover. If you were angry, then you were the problem. If you were distant, then you were cold. If you were upset, then you were too sensitive. Your pain became the distraction from her behavior. And as long as you stayed locked in that dynamic, she never had to take accountability. The relationship was about your flaws, your reactions, your shortcomings, never hers. But healing strips that dynamic away. When you stop engaging, when you stop explaining, when you stop justifying your every thought and feeling, she no longer has anywhere to hide. Suddenly, there's no more deflection, no more convenient excuses. Your silence becomes louder than any argument ever was. It speaks to a truth she can no longer run from, that you were never the problem. Her inability to face herself was. And that's when the panic begins to set in, because now she's confronted with something far more uncomfortable than your anger, your absence. And not just physical absence, but emotional absence. You're no longer emotionally available for her to feed off of. You're not responding to her games. You're not participating in her patterns. And that emotional silence, it echoes. It forces her to sit with her own thoughts, her own behaviors, her own guilt. And for someone who's spent years avoiding introspection, that's terrifying. Most people who manipulate others, whether consciously or unconsciously, build a reality where they're always the misunderstood victim. They convince themselves that everyone else is to blame for their pain, that the world just doesn't understand them, that they keep getting hurt because they care too much. But your healing challenges that narrative. It removes the scapegoat. It dismantles the story. Because if you're no longer broken, no longer reacting, no longer chasing, then she has to ask herself, why did things fall apart? And that's a question she may not be ready to answer. Because the answer isn't comfortable. It involves looking at the manipulation, the lies, the emotional games, the projection. It involves admitting that maybe, just maybe, the person she claimed to love was the one she consistently hurt. That maybe the chaos wasn't the result of your flaws, but of her refusal to grow. And when you remove yourself from the dynamic, when you begin to heal and rebuild and detach, she's left to face those truths alone. And you know what's even more unsettling for her? The fact that your healing is calm. It's not loud. It doesn't need to prove anything. It just is. You're no longer fighting for her to see your worth. You've already found it. You're no longer explaining why you deserve respect. You've started giving it to yourself. And that kind of quiet confidence doesn't just challenge her, it haunts her. Because it proves that the problem was never your inability to love or commit or try. The problem was that you kept doing those things in a space that couldn't receive them. When someone has built their identity around control and deflection, your peace is their discomfort. Your healing forces them to confront a version of themselves they've tried to avoid. And most won't admit it, not openly, but you'll see it in the way they reach out, the way they test your boundaries, the way they suddenly want to talk, to reconnect, to get closure. But closure, they're looking for the old dynamic. They're looking for proof that they still matter, that they still have access, that you're still willing to carry what was never yours to begin with. But you've changed. You've stepped out of that role. And now the only thing left for her to face is herself. That's the mirror your healing creates. It's not meant to shame or punish. It's just the natural consequence of stepping out of dysfunction, of reclaiming your voice, of letting silence speak for you when words no longer work. And that silence says everything. I've seen enough. I've felt enough. and I've finally learned to choose myself. There's something unsettling that happens when you begin to rebuild your identity after the damage. Not because you've become cold or bitter, but because you're no longer emotionally available to be controlled. You see, when you were broken, when you were trying to make sense of the pain, desperate for clarity, caught in a loop of overthinking and self-doubt, you were easier to manage, easier to mold. Your emotional wounds made you malleable. You were constantly seeking answers, constantly asking, what did I do wrong? How can I fix this? What does she need from me now? That vulnerability gave her power. But when you begin to heal, that all changes. You start to realize that not every criticism was valid, not every silent treatment was justified, and not every emotional outburst had to be absorbed by you. That clarity shifts your entire orientation. You stop reacting from a place of shame. You stop feeling responsible for someone else's inability to communicate, to be honest, to love in a healthy way. And the moment that shift begins, when your sense of self begins to rise again, it doesn't go unnoticed, especially not by the one who once held control over your emotional state. She starts to notice you're no longer available in the same way. Not emotionally, not mentally, not energetically. She feels it. Your presence used to orbit around her moods, her demands, her insecurities. You adjusted yourself again and again in 1,000 little ways just to keep the peace. But now you're anchored in your own truth. And when you refuse to contort yourself to fit her narrative, that emotional distance becomes a warning sign to her that something has shifted permanently. And here's the paradox. She doesn't want the real you, at least not the you that's whole. She wants the version of you that's still bleeding, the one who doubts himself, the one who needs her validation, because that version is easier to manipulate. That version will keep trying to prove his worth, will keep fighting for love that always felt just out of reach. But when you begin to step into your wholeness, she starts to panic, not out of love, but out of fear. Fear of losing the control she once had over how you saw yourself. That's what emotional availability really is in these kinds of relationships. It's not vulnerability in a healthy, reciprocal way. It's a tool, a doorway. If she could access your emotions, she could steer the relationship. And if she could steer it, she could make you question your sanity, your strength, your direction. But the moment she starts losing access, she realizes she's no longer the axis you revolve around. You're not chasing the apology anymore. You're not over-explaining. You're not walking on eggshells or tiptoeing around her triggers. You're just done. And that's what drives the panic. Because emotional availability to someone like that wasn't about connection. It was about leverage. It was how she kept the upper hand. And when she loses that, she's not just losing you, she's losing the reflection of herself she controlled, the dynamic that gave her a sense of significance. And the panic shows up in subtle ways. A message at midnight, a cryptic post, a random check-in masked as concern. But underneath all of it is one central fear that you're actually healing and she can't stop it. And let's be honest, healing doesn't mean you stop feeling. It doesn't mean you don't still remember, still ache, still wonder what might have been. But it does mean you've stopped handing over your emotional life to someone who couldn't handle it with care. It means you've stopped letting your self-worth depend on someone who couldn't see your value unless you were in pain. And that's a kind of strength that no longer requires an offer. The irony is that she may suddenly become more attentive, more affectionate, more invested because the loss of control triggers a fear of abandonment. But it's not real change. It's a reaction to the change in you. It's not love. It's panic dressed up as romance. And if you fall for it, the cycle starts again. But if you hold your ground, if you recognize the difference between guilt and growth, between manipulation and maturity, you will walk away for good. Not because you hate her, but because you finally love yourself enough to protect your peace. That's why emotional availability becomes a threat to someone who built their power on your confusion. And the moment she senses that you're no longer playing the role, no longer staying small, no longer giving access to your emotions for her benefit, that's the moment she knows the dynamic is over. And nothing is more terrifying to someone who relied on your vulnerability for control than realizing they've lost access to the emotional world they used to dominate. That's the moment she starts to feel what you felt all along. And the silence you once feared becomes your greatest protection. There's a strange reversal that happens when you stop being the one who's always chasing clarity. At first, it feels like a loss, like walking away from a battlefield without finishing the fight. You think, if I just had one more conversation, if I just explained it the right way, maybe then she'd understand. Maybe then she'd take accountability. But over time, you realize that some people don't want clarity. They want confusion. They thrive in it. Because in confusion, there's power. There's space to twist reality, to rewrite history, to escape responsibility. So when you stop seeking answers from someone who was never willing to be honest in the first place, something unexpected happens. You shift the entire dynamic. See, as long as you're asking why did you lie, why did you change, why couldn't you just love me properly, you were still holding on to hope. And that hope, while it may have felt like strength, was actually keeping you tethered to a false reality. It was keeping you emotionally invested in someone who had already shown you in 100 different ways that your emotional well-being was never their priority. And they could feel it, that grip, that longing, that uncertainty. It gave them an edge, because as long as you needed closure from them, they were still in control of the narrative. But when you stop chasing answers, when you accept that some apologies will never come, that some truths will never be spoken, and that some people will never have the courage to face themselves, that's when things begin to turn. You stop asking why and start asking what now. And that shift from backwards looking to forward moving, from questioning to building, from needing to knowing, that's what really breaks the cycle. That's when she starts to panic. Because for the first time, you're not holding the door open anymore. And here's what most people don't realize. The moment you stop needing her to see your side is the moment she starts noticing what she lost. It's not just about losing you physically. It's about losing access to your emotional world. The one she used to manipulate, the one she could always count on being open, vulnerable, raw. You're no longer available for that kind of emotional extraction. You're no longer waiting by the phone, checking for texts, replaying the last conversation in your head. You're done. Not bitter, not angry, just done. And that's what unsettles her more than anything. Because the person who's panicking now is the one who used to be so sure you'd never leave. She was confident that no matter what she did, how distant, how dismissive, how hurtful, you'd always come back with another chance. That was the rhythm. You absorb the pain, she controls the pace. You ask for honesty, she dodges with charm or silence. And as long as you kept dancing to that tune, she never had to reflect. But now you've stepped off the stage entirely. And that silence, that lack of reaction, that absence of pursuit, it speaks volumes. When you're no longer chasing the narrative, you're no longer participating in the illusion. You begin to see her not through the lens of what you hoped she would be, but through the reality of what she actually was. And that kind of clarity doesn't just change your perspective, it changes your energy. You stop responding to the bait. You stop feeling guilty for setting boundaries. You stop explaining your worth. And when that happens, she feels it. She sees the change, not in your words, but in your detachment. And detachment doesn't mean you don't care. It means you care too much about your peace to allow it to be jeopardized again. You care too much about your own growth to continue being pulled into a cycle that only leads to emotional regression. You care enough to walk away without theatrics, without warnings, without needing her to understand. Because healing isn't about forcing someone to validate your pain. It's about validating it yourself and moving forward regardless. And that's when her panic takes on a new form. She might reach out, she might pretend nothing happened, she might act as if she's finally changed, but it's not genuine. It's not born out of accountability, it's born out of fear. Fear that she's lost the one person who was always there, always forgiving, always trying. But you're not that person anymore. You've evolved past the need for her recognition, and in doing so, you've created a reality where her opinion no longer defines your identity. You don't need her to get it. You don't need her to apologize. You don't need her to validate your experience. You've reclaimed the narrative by letting go of the one she wrote for you. And that, more than any confrontation, any argument, any explanation, is what truly ends the cycle. The moment you stop seeking understanding from someone who was never honest is the moment you become free. There's something deeply unsettling to people who once had power over you when they see you rise without their validation. It's not just that you moved on, that would be hard enough. It's that you moved on quietly. No dramatic exit, no final plea, no emotional confrontation, just silence, just peace. Just the decision to stop engaging, stop explaining, and stop feeding energy into a dynamic that was always designed to keep you small. That kind of exit hits differently because it's not loud, but it's permanent. And that permanence creates a vacuum they can't fill. You see, when you were wounded and still seeking closure, you were predictable. You would reach out, you would try to fix things, you would ask questions, you would hang on to fragments of hope because you still believed that if you just said the right thing or waited long enough, things might go back to the way they were. That predictability gave her a sense of comfort, not because she intended to grow with you, but because she always knew you'd be there, orbiting her mood, validating her choices, anchoring her instability with your consistency. But now your silence is the only response she's getting. And there's no control in silence. People who manipulate through emotion don't just fear confrontation, they fear indifference. They fear being ignored. They fear losing the grip they had, not just on your heart, but on your identity. Because when someone has gotten used to being the center of your emotional world, your healing becomes an existential threat to their relevance. And so when you withdraw, truly withdraw, without resentment, without bitterness, without the need to prove anything, it leaves them with nothing to push against, no fuel, no leverage, no access. It's not just about walking away, it's about who you become when you do. You're no longer operating from a place of reaction. You're not checking for responses. You're not looking for signs of change. You're focused inward. You're rebuilding your mind, your emotional stability, your life. And she can feel it. That calm detachment you've cultivated doesn't make you cruel, it makes you untouchable. Because what once affected you deeply now passes through you. What once triggered you now simply confirms your decision to leave. And this is the most important part. Healing isn't about showing her how much better you're doing. It's not about making her regret losing you. It's not about proving your worth externally. True healing is quiet, it's subtle, it's personal. It's that moment when you realize you no longer care what she thinks of you, because you've redefined yourself on your own terms. You've reclaimed your narrative from the hands of someone who used to rewrite it for you. And the power in that, it's not aggressive, it's not boastful, but it's undeniable. The panic she feels now isn't just about you leaving, it's about you no longer being the same version of yourself she used to manipulate. That old version, the one who tolerated the silence, the gaslighting, the shifting blame, that version doesn't exist anymore. And the absence of that version is what triggers her most. Because now she's forced to sit with the reality of who she is without your emotional labor holding everything together. She might not admit it, she may never acknowledge the role she played, but deep down she knows. And that knowledge, when it's paired with your complete silence, creates a type of internal chaos she can't calm. Because she's not used to you having peace. She's used to you reaching, striving, hoping. And when you no longer play that role, she's left to face the parts of herself that were always hidden behind your emotional availability. The truth is, people don't panic when they lose something disposable. They panic when they lose something irreplaceable. And your growth, your strength, your clarity, those things aren't easily replaced. She'll try. She may project onto someone new. She may pretend she's unfazed. But there will always be that quiet awareness, that whisper in the back of her mind reminding her that she lost someone who genuinely tried, someone who stayed longer than they should have, someone who would never given up if there had been anything real to hold on to. But you didn't just walk away from her, you walked back to yourself. And that's the part she never anticipated. She expected you to suffer in the silence, to collapse under the weight of her absence, but instead you rose. Not in defiance, but in self-respect. Not to hurt her, but to heal you. And that kind of transformation, that quiet, steady, unwavering evolution is what makes her panic more than anything else. Because once you've tasted peace, you'll never trade it again for chaos dressed as love.